Welcome back. This is Your Story Corner, a safe space designed and created specifically to help you relax and unwind, to remind you that you are not alone. And no matter whatever is going on in the world right now, remember, it will pass. It's going to pass. And you are going to be okay. You're going to be okay. If you are new to this podcast, welcome. So glad you have found it. If you are a lover of books and stories, poems and poetry, then you're in the right place. And if you enjoy being read to and a good bedtime story, then you are definitely in the right place. I believe in the power and the comforting ways the words can help us relax, coupled with the most famous and brilliant stories passed from generations to generations. We explore some of those in this podcast series, and then I read you to sleep, or to help you just feel calm and relax as you go about your day. So whether you are settling down for a good night's sleep, or popping in your headphones while you get through whatever that thing that needs to be done can be done, we're glad you have found us. To find out more about Your Story Corner, you can visit our website, Yourstorycorner.com, and follow us on all our social media platforms. And thank you for all the follows and all the interactions. You can find us on Instagram right now. The link is on our website, or you can search for us there. We're on Threads and X, as it is now known. And of course, we are on TikTok. And there on TikTok, we go live and read you bedtime stories, 10 p.m. UK time, and we hope to see you there. So settle down, relax, get comfy now, get cozy, snuggle up in bed, or just if you can, focus on the sound of my voice, the comfort and the noise of the crackling fireplace, and bring the stories to life in your mind. Paint the pictures. This is Your Story Corner. This week, we're going to look at one of the most famous of all storytellers, Beatrix Potter. Often when we do our live bedtime stories, we get requested for the tales of Peter Rabbit and friends. But what do you know about Beatrix Potter? We'll explore some amazing facts and information about her, and then I'll read you tonight's bedtime story of Peter Rabbit. Potter was born in London on July the 28th, 1866, and was actually christened Helen after her mother, but was known by her more unusual middle name, Beatrix. And her most famous book, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which I'll read to you shortly, was inspired by an illustrated letter the Potter wrote to Noel, son of her former governess Annie, back in 1893. She later asked to borrow the letter back and copied the pictures in the story, which she then adapted to create the much-loved tale. And Peter Rabbit was modelled on Potter's own pet rabbit, Peter Piper, a much-cherished bunny, who Potter frequently sketched and took for walks on a leash. Though Potter's first pet rabbit was called Benjamin Bouncer. What a name. And was the inspiration for Benjamin Bunny. Of course, Peter's cousin in her books. And Potter loved sketching both the rabbits, especially Benjamin. And in 1890, after a publisher purchased some of her sketches, she decided to reward him with some hemp seeds. And, quoting, "The consequence being that when I wanted to draw him next morning, he was intoxicated and wholly unimaginable," she later wrote in her diary. But Peter Rabbit wasn't an immediate success, which is incredible, really, when you think about it. Potter self-published The Tale of Peter Rabbit in 1901. Yes, it's been around that long. Funding the print run of 250 copies herself after, would you believe, being turned down by several commercial publishers. But in 1902, the book was republished by Frederick Warne & Co. after Potter agreed to redo her black and white illustrations into colour. And by the end of its first year in print, it was so much in demand, it had to be reprinted 6 times. Now, much like very, very clever creative people, in 1903, Potter, recognizing the merchandising opportunities offered by her success, made her own Peter Rabbit doll, which she registered at the patent office. And a Peter Rabbit board game and wallpaper also were produced in her lifetime. She lived a secreted life, and in fact it is recorded in 1881 and 1897. Potter kept a journal in which she jotted down her private thoughts in a secret code. Now, and this code was so fiendishly difficult, it was not cracked and translated until 1958, some of which you can find on the internet. Potter was, of course, a prolific writer, producing between 2 and 3 stories every year, ultimately writing around 28 books in total, including The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, The Tale of Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, and The Tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher. Potter's stories now have been translated into over 35 different languages and have sold over 100 million copies combined. Though curiously, in 1926, Potter published a longer work called The Fairy Caravan. It was at first only published in America because she felt it was too autobiographical to be published in England during her lifetime. She also told her English publishers that it wasn't as good as her other work and felt it wouldn't be well received. But 9 years after she passed away in 1943, the book was finally released in the UK and can be read today. Sadly, as her eyesight diminished, it became harder and harder for Potter to produce the beautiful drawings that characterized her work. As a result, many of her later books were pieced together from earlier drawings in her vast collection of sketchbooks. The Tale of Little Pig Robinson was Potter's last picture book and was published in 1930. There was, however, a lost Potter story, The Tale of Kitty in Boots, and was rediscovered in 2013 and published in the summer of 2016. Publisher Joe Hanks found references to the story in an out-of-print biography of Beatrix Potter, and so when searching through the writer's archive at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Hanks discovered a sketch of the kitty cat in question, plus a rough layout of the unedited manuscript. The story was published with supplementary illustrations by Quentin Blake, who you may know drawed for most of the classic Roald Dahl stories. Among her many, many talents. She was also an award-winning sheep farmer, and in 1943 was the first woman elected president of the Herdwick Sheep Breeders Association. Try remember that one for a pop quiz. And of course, when she passed away in 1943, she was the age of 77, and she left 14 farms, 4,000 acres of land in the Lake District in the UK's National Trust, Britain's National Trust, ensuring the beloved landscape that inspired her work would be preserved. And you can visit Hilltop, her home. The Trust opened her house, called Hilltop, which she brought in 1905, now to the public in 1946. I often wonder, did she know how many people those famous books would touch and be read to all those years ago? But that gift of the land and the works that inspired her to go on inspire many other people. Amazing. So there are some fascinating facts I hope you enjoyed about Beatrix Potter. But now, time for your story. And as I mentioned, in 1901, Potter sent her manuscript of The Tale of Peter Rabbit to at least 6 publishers, only to have it refused by each of them. Can you believe it? She made the decision to print the book herself, whilst continuing the search for the publisher. And some of those original books can be seen in museums, and anyone ever stumbled across one, well, you hang on to it. Be quite a find. So, time for your bedtime story. Hopefully you're all cozy and tucked up. You in bed already? Good. Or maybe you're just taking a break in the day. Well, remember to breathe deeply. Close your eyes and enjoy your bedtime story. The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank, underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and our umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little buddies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees, planting out young cabbages, but he jumped and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. And he rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath the flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently Peter sneezed. Achoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head, and Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scratch. Peter scuttled underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. Good old Peter Rabbit. Well, as we've got a little bit more time, and as a treat, let's do another. This is the tale of Benjamin Bunny, first published by Frederick Warne & Co. in September 1904. It is often called the sequel to the tale of Peter Rabbit, and was an instant commercial success, selling 20,000 copies upon release, and then another 10,000 copies printed in the last few months of 1904. So I hope you're sitting comfortably, curled up in bed. Remember to close your eyes. Paint the pictures in your mind. Focus on the sound of my voice and the crackling fire. And if you're going to sleep, good night. Sleep tight. This is Your Story Corner. The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the chit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along down the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and a jump to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt, as in his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter Rabbit was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who's got your clothes?" Peter replied, "Scarecrow Mr. McGregor's garden," and described how he'd been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped that it would rain. And at this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard inside the rabbit hole, calling, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch more chamomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam o'shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had also been sown with lettuces. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took him off the scarecrow. There had been some rain during the night, and there was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam o'shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny, and the lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home, and presently he dropped half the onions. Little Benjamin said it was not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly towards the other end of the garden. They went along a little walk on planks under a soddy red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps, cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently Peter let the pocket handkerchief go again. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. And this is what those little rabbits saw around that corner. A cat. Little Benjamin took one look, and then in half a minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath the large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got around behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall onto the top of the cat and cuffed it off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with his little switch. And then he took out his nephew Peter. And then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling, with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. The end. Naughty little rabbits. Well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's bedtime story, The Tale of Peter Rabbit and The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. But which one is your favorite? Maybe you enjoy Mrs. Tiggywinkle, Tom Kitten, Jeremiah Puddle Duck. Many more tales from Beatrix Potter are there to be explored, and maybe one day we'll read some more here. But for now, it's time to say goodbye, or good night if you're off to sleep. Thank you for joining us here on Your Story Corner, the podcast. Remember, you can find out more about us on our website, Yourstorycorner.com. And make sure to join us soon for another TikTok Live, where we'll be reading some of your favorite bedtime stories. And lastly, thank you. We've had incredibly in a month's time, nearly 2,000 downloads of this podcast. So thank you for doing so. Thank you for listening and sharing and rating and helping us grow this so we can help many more people discover more books and hopefully help in any way we can to provide some calm, company, kindness to the world. So thank you for your support. And until next time, remember, you are not alone. It will pass, and you are going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Take care. Sleep well. Night-night.